Eminencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all, and a special thank you to Monsignor Vitillo for inviting me to be with you for this meeting. And I'm really looking forward not only to being with you for the next half an hour when I'll be speaking, but also to sitting in and listening to your discussions and conversations. That's a genuine privilege for me. I fear that Monsignor Vitillo has slightly oversold me, so we'll see how we go, but lower your expectations. Okay. So what Monsignor Vitillo has asked me to do is talk a little about the Church's social teaching on migration and some of my own reflections on living with that tradition and attempting to inhabit it. My own experience of connecting to the social teaching of the Church on migration issues came about 10 years ago when I was working as a volunteer in an immigration detention centre facility in the United Kingdom. We continue in the UK to detain about 30,000 migrants a year. This was the first time that I had come face to face with a range of individuals who shared with me their stories of the reality that was both for them intensely personal, but also so clearly to me a structural global reality that would come to define our times. I also understood for the first time that as the citizen of a Western nation state, that I was not a person outside of this reality, but that I too was personally involved and implicated in this reality in a very particular way. I felt claimed by this experience. So to make sense of this reality, I read and I thought about what I had been hearing and seeing. And I found that the Church's social teaching had something profound to say to my experience. In fact, perhaps a little unusually for a theologian, it was facing the challenge of migration as a defining issue of our times that enabled me to re-engage with the Church's social teaching on wider economic, political, and social issues. It brought the body of Catholic social teaching on what Pope Pius called the social question back to life for me. It moved it from being a historical museum piece to an urgent living tradition. So my research for the last 10 years has been trying to make sense of both the reality of global migration and also trying to contribute to the development of a new generation of Catholic social teaching fit for the migration reality that marks our times. I see this task as a shared task that stretches from the local level to the global, and that includes local communities, as well as professional practitioners, refugees and migrants, academics and church leaders. This is to enact the idea of the common good as a practice, not just a theory of social life. Now, what I want to do now this morning is explore both the background to the Church's social teaching on migration and also the wider tradition of social teaching, particularly on the common good, that might help us think about the challenges and the opportunities that we face. The Bible is arguably a history of migrant peoples. It tells the story of migrations that are chosen, even blessed, and also of migrations that are forced, through which God still acts, but which God laments, and sometimes of migrations that are both forced and blessed. Think, for example, of the person of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah is both the most detained, imprisoned character in the Old Testament. His story is spent in and out of forms of house arrest, prison. Even he faces attempted murder. And he's also subject to many of the practices of terror and isolation that haunt the world of migration today. Yet Jeremiah is also God's prophet. This makes the Bible a troubling and intriguing resource for our times because it does not start from a place that sees migration as either only good or bad. It tells a much richer, truer story. This complex history of the people of God as both literally and spiritually a migrant people has shaped generations of Jewish and Christian social practice, from cities of sanctuary in the Old Testament and the early church to religious orders established to cross newly formed borders and care for those on the move, to new forms of hospitality, accompaniment and hosting. Of course, this history has not always been good, from the reality of ghettos to, in more recent times in my own country, the role that the church played, regrettably, in creating the child migrant schemes that caused unimaginable suffering to so many. We too, as the church, have our own history of grace and sin. Nonetheless, one of the striking things about Catholic social teaching's tradition is that migration has been one of its most significant and constant themes since at least the 1850s. We often connect Catholic social teaching in our minds to economics, and yet migration has been one of its most continuous concerns, not just at the level of theory, but also in the realm of practice. The migrations out of Europe to the Americas in the mid-19th century saw a new need to make provision for the religious and pastoral needs of Catholic migrants. A century later, and following the catastrophe of the Second World War, this pastoral, social and spiritual work developed into a more overtly theological set of reflections, so moving from making pastoral provision for Catholics to this development of a tradition of overt theological reflection about what God is doing through the experience of migration. The Church's most significant document on migration, Exul Familia, was published in 1952, and it had an immediate effect on the way that the Catholic community reflected on migration. Exul Familia introduced a series of new, strongly theological reflections on migration into the body of Catholic social teaching. It introduced the idea that we should be reading the Bible and the biblical tradition and thinking about doctrine as reflection on migration. The Holy Family, it says, were both the models and the protectors for all displaced persons. The Church had always understood that it had a role in exercising the works of mercy towards migrants. That same document also drew on Pius XII's great wartime emphasis on human dignity and argued that forced migration was a threat to both human dignity and security. And if you haven't read them yet, and I'm sure there's at least one person in the room who hasn't read them yet, the Christmas messages issued by Pope Pius during the Second World War are quite extraordinary repositories of reflection on the nature of dignity that are fit, I think, very much for our own times. Later Vatican documents on migration, including John Paul II's updating of Exul Familia, entitled Erga Migrantes Caritas Christi, deepened this vein of theological reflection. The Old Testament themes of Exodus and covenant, two key themes for thinking about migration theologically, are used to remind the Church that Christians are called to live out of the memory of having themselves been a community of exile. God makes a covenant with his people, not a social contract. He invites us into the heart of his life that makes us both participants in a divine drama of love and forgiveness, and also, therefore, always spiritual strangers in a foreign land. The prophetic tradition is drawn on by John Paul II to offer a vision of hospitality and care for the stranger and the oppressed. And we're reminded about the uncomfortable truth that God chooses the displaced and the stranger to be a difficult and mysterious messenger of his truth, a truth that we, including the Church, often find difficult to hear and interpret. These biblical prophets often reveal our own departure as settled people from faithfulness, and this idea that migrants and refugees are sent as bearers of truth, as revealers of truth to us, that unsettle the settled, and that this message can be difficult to hear, is a theme that Pope Francis has gone back to, has returned to in his own reflections on migration. Drawing from the New Testament, Erga Migrantes Caritas Christi notes the migration of God himself through history in the Incarnation. Jesus repeats the journey of the people of God into exile, and in entirely practical terms, he aids the stranger and tells us to do likewise. From the book of Revelation and from the Pentecost story, key lessons are drawn for the way that the church should understand herself. The Church of Pentecost is presented as a diverse, intercultural society. What is also interesting is that occasionally church documents also note the significance of that line in Revelation in which we are told that people from every nation, every tribe, every people will be presented before the throne of the Lamb. Scripture and the church's tradition do not simply present to us an individualistic vision of what it means to think ethically about migration. They present to us a vision in which culture and identities and communities must meaningfully be thought about. Perhaps above all, the church's documents on migration challenge our culture to move away from two very poor choices about the way that we see migrants, either as threats to peace, order and prosperity on the one hand, or as passive suffering victims in need of salvation. Both of these are not where the church begins its teaching. The theological tradition presents migrants as self-determining, but also interdependent human agents whose action and whose dignity must be engaged with and protected. It presents them as bearers of a true peace. It presents them as people who are both uprooted and who necessarily uproot others whose mindset cannot cope with them as stranger. Again, we will return to this theme of suffering and agency when we look in a moment at Pope Francis's contribution. So over the course of the last 50 years, this biblical and doctrinal material has also been used to develop a set of natural law principles to guide the practice of human government in matters of forced migration. And I'm briefly going to set out the natural law principles that the Church has developed, thinking mainly in this instance about forced migration and refugees. And I realise your work is much wider than this, but I thought it was worth just noting these. So first of all, Catholic social teaching begins its teaching on natural law principles for guiding policy making with the principle of peace. It proposes a right to stay, a right to remain, a right not to be displaced. We all need membership of a stable, covenantal political community to survive, and it is the duty of those who govern to provide the conditions for this stability. This principle has clear implications for conflict resolution and development policies as a matter of priority to address the root causes of displacement. However, the second principle notes that governments will often fail in this task. And so the second principle states, where there is conflict, persecution, violence, or hunger, there exists a natural and absolute right of the individual to migrate and a natural right to seek sanctuary within an alternative, safe political community. As human beings, we seek our own good, and this should not be frustrated. Thirdly, this principle implies a moral requirement for nation states to receive the refugee. We all have an inalienable membership of a universal human family, the Church teaches, and we seek membership of political communities in order to live well. The task of human government is to recognise both these goods. Because I am a member of a human family, I have a right to a place of safety and participation. For these same reasons, Catholic social teaching offers a fourth principle, the imperfect right of a sovereign political community to regulate its borders and control migration. Catholic social teaching is not yet a radically open borders policy in political terms, even if the Church itself understands itself as an open borders community. Catholic social teaching has not proposed, therefore, completely open borders, but neither does it recognise borders as divinely ordained, as some traditions, including some Christian traditions, do. Rather, in Catholic social teaching, borders are conceived as a relative good and recognised as legitimate only insofar as they both protect the common good of the established community and are porous and humane and capable of welcoming the stranger. Political communities are invited to include within the exercise of sovereignty the establishment and oversight of just measures for those who seek sanctuary and admittance to their borders. Finally, recognising the nature of the human person and their dignity, the Church teaches a need for both migrant participation and contribution to a host society. It's interesting that the Church very rarely uses the language of integration. It talks about participation and it talks about contribution, which I think is interesting, and that raises interesting challenges for the many cultures and their assumptions within which we have to work. So the Church teaches a need for both migrant participation and contribution to a host society, and therefore a responsibility to enable real social, economic, civic, political participation of the migrant in the host community. So this also challenges cultures and societies who place a strong emphasis on the integration of migrants, but who construct policies that frustrate the very possibility of such a thing, because it insists on mutual duties of participation and the conditions necessary to enable that participation in a meaningful way. So a turn away now from the tone of natural law thinking and into a very different world, the tone that Pope Francis has chosen to adopt on migration. Pope Francis's own contribution to addressing the question of migration has been rather different in both style and tone to his recent predecessors. Firstly, Francis has insisted on making personal journeys to be with those who are making their migrant journeys. He describes these journeys as gestures of closeness. While in Lampedusa, Francis delivered a now famous homily which began with a reflection on the first two questions which God ever asks human beings in the scriptures. Adam, where are you? Cain, where is your brother? Francis interprets these passages as stories of human disorientation, of the first signs of a tendency in humankind to lose our place within creation, to lose our orientation as creatures towards a creator. Thus, to fall, or to sin for Francis, is to be disorientated or uprooted, to lose our bearings. It is interesting that Francis juxtaposes, he situates next to each other, this account of the disorientation of the settled people in relation to the orientation of the displaced. So he sees those on the move as being people oriented towards the pursuit of goods, of survival, of flourishing, of the need for political belonging. And he notes the disorientation, particularly of Europe, in his writings, of settled communities who cannot see migrants for who they are and for their own orientation to a good. And he argues that one of the first things the church must do in teaching on migration now is to see the disorientation of the settled. A conversation about migration is not just a conversation about migrants. Francis roots this disorientation not only in a classic account of the fall, but also in the features of our own times. He sees this as a generational, cultural matter that the church must call out theologically. So he draws attention to the culture of well-being. The culture of well-being, Francis says, breeds indifference towards others. Part of the culture of well-being is to become accustomed to the suffering of others. Our own transient cultural ways breeds indifference towards truly transient people. Thus, globalization, which creates, ironically, the transience of the settled. So he's messing with the categories we might use to think of migrants as being people who are on the move. He's pointing out that actually we live in deeply transient cultures. So globalization for Francis creates, ironically, the transience of the settled, produces too, as its byproduct, the globalization of indifference. In turn, the byproduct of the culture of indifference is that we see ourselves become anonymous. We seem unable to understand ourselves as named, particular, responsible people in relation to other named, particular, responsible others. The globalization of indifference, Francis says, makes all of us unnamed, leaders without names and without faces. This indifference and anonymity is precisely the opposite, Francis says, of the creature-creator, God-humanity relationship. In the creature-creator relationship, we are named, and as named beings, we are called to account for other named beings. Think about how much of the ritual and the liturgy of the church is about naming and the significance of being named. Adam, where are you? Cain, where is your brother? This approach to the ethics of migration deals less with the external borders of the nation state and the ethics we might apply to it, and more with the prior internalized borders of the human mind and the human will as a matter about which we must speak theologically. These two sets of borders, one geopolitical and external, the other interior to the human self, are read in relationship to each other in Francis's teaching. He wishes us to see the deep practical interconnections between these two sets of borders. However, two other comments in Francis's teaching should be made. In Laudato Si, Francis connects the failure of law to a deep, in relation to migration matters, to a deep failure in civil society. So Francis doesn't just point his finger at political leaders. He also says, if there's a failure in relation to matters of migration, then there is also a failure in civil society. Indifference to migrant suffering in Europe, he suggests, is not just a failure of government or the individual, but what he calls the loss of that sense of responsibility for our fellow men and women upon which all of civil society is founded. So civil society is the context, he says, in which compassion must be generated and kept alive. While political messaging matters, and we can see that globally, it is also the case that it is not political leadership that necessarily is the engine that generates compassion and sustains it. So a failure of compassion in the case of migrant welcome indicates for Pope Francis a failure of civil society to be itself. And this is a failure as much as any failure of state political leadership. Finally, and perhaps most controversially for some, the notion that the social teaching of the church should lead us back towards a willingness to suffer and as a form of solidarity, so that suffering might be a form of solidarity, is another emerging hallmark of Francis's pontificate. Francis contrasts the well-being culture that seeks to protect the person from any suffering to a Christian social ethics that sees taking on board the suffering of the other as a key part of what it means to be a disciple of Christ. In Laudato Si, Francis goes as far as to suggest that this ability to feel with the suffering of the other and to enter into that journey defines the very task not just of the individual, but of Catholic social teaching as a body of thought itself. And this is just to quote him. Our goal in developing Catholic social teaching, this is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to become painfully aware, to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. Now, in the short time I have left, I want to do two things very briefly. Point to two areas which are perhaps a little neglected, but could be significant elements for thinking about resources in a fresh way, for thinking about migration in our context. And then to say a little in conclusion about some new challenges for CST more generally in relation to migration. So whilst the Christian tradition has lots of material for thinking theoretically about migration, It also has, and ICMC is a witness to this, a history of Christian practice guided by the Holy Spirit. Chief in this area is the history of offering sanctuary and asylum. Our current national and international asylum laws relate to a history of offering refuge that has its roots in the biblical Jewish cities of sanctuary and the Christian practices of offering territorial sanctuary in churches and monasteries. Only from the 16th century onwards did the state begin to take over this formerly much more ecclesial practice and formalize this into asylum laws. Gradually, this became something that the state did and not the church. Whilst no one suggests reversing this process of history, nonetheless, this history of practice, of practical witness, has been the inspiration for a global movement of cities of sanctuaries in our own time, who are reinventing this Christian practice of offering hospitality. Rethinking forms of Christian sanctuary for a very different age is something that the churches are now beginning to do in quite important ways. And I think there is an important space of imagination in drawing not only from the scriptures, not only from natural law thinking, not only from the teaching as powerful as it is by Pope Francis, but also remembering our practical history of hospitality. A further area where I think there is significant resource for thinking differently and challenging structures of power within the deeper Catholic tradition is found in its thinking about the nature of the good and the common good, and this is the final section of what I will say. Over the last few years, in work I have done with migrants in immigration detention, I began to notice how often they used the language of good and evil to describe their experience. I also began to notice that this same language of good and evil has reinvented itself in the public life of the West at very least. Distinctions between deserving and undeserving migrants. In my own context, our own previous Prime Minister noted good migrants stay in camps and wait for international rescue. Bad migrants forge their own path on the high seas. High-skilled migration is seen as in the national interest. Low-skilled migration is seen, terrible language, but it's used politically. Low-skilled migration is seen as negative, a loss and a burden. And it struck me that detainees were using this language of good and evil very carefully to make sense of their experience. And that secondly, that this public language is used in ways that Christians really should have a problem with, and more than that, a response to. This got me thinking about St. Augustine. Augustine understands evil not as a thing or an independent substance or as a person, but rather he understands evil as the process through which the good is lost. In other words, evil happens when people and systems repeatedly turn away from the possibility of the good. Evil is simply a lack of the good. Listening to the experiences of those on the move who are seeking status, it is not difficult to spot processes which formalize the absence, lack, or loss of human goods. Detention, destitution, denials of legal pathways and family reunion, the manner in which the human contact is conducted between authorities and individual migrants, between smugglers, traffickers, and migrants. But the point is a bigger one. A theology of the good insists that we start our dialogue with the human goods that we strive for. The theological story always starts with questions of the good, with the enfleshment of the good. Catholic social teaching has a language for talking about the good, the common good, which is made up of individual goods and public goods. We can talk rationally about what these goods are and why they are human mutual obligations. I think that one of the most striking things about the public debate among states about migration is either that any talk about the goods that a migration policy should aim for is either totally absent or there is simply deep confusion about what counts as a good and how it might be pursued. Here we can make a contribution from the wider tradition of Catholic social teaching, as well as from our experience on the ground. But a theology of the good, rather than just a political philosophy of the good, is aimed not only at freedom and justice, but also at the life of communion. This is what makes it a theology. The Church carries a duty to foster and proclaim this as the end goal of all social life, and to cooperate in making this word flesh. For these reasons, I think that Catholic organisations working directly with migrants and able to influence public debate can play a crucial role in at least 3 ways. Firstly, to articulate the vision of the good and the processes through which those goods are lost as you see them on the ground for the migrants that you work with. Secondly, to challenge the basis of public policy in the light of these experiences, asking why in relation to the mechanisms of these systems and challenging the systems to pursue genuine individual, public and common goods through law and through practices of hospitality. Thirdly, populism, the rise of populism, teaches us that there is a failure to understand the full range of goods that matter to people in everyday life, whether the settled, so-called settled population or those on the move. We do not have mechanisms for engaging well with these ordinary losses of everyday life, of the good, that create anger and resentment, depression and disengagement. Our CST tradition of thinking about the good offers us a language for dialogue about a sense of what has been lost in a culture of transience and what is under threat as people experience this in their everyday lives. These are conversations that need to be had across and between hosts and migrants, classes of groups, nation states. They're also conversations that should be had across Catholic organisations and communities. Fourthly, this is a practical tradition which emphasises that states must do more, but that states will never be able to fulfil the full vision of the gospel with regards to a duty to migrants. This requires a culture of encounter, accompaniment, dialogue, hospitality, and also increased willingness by the Church to resist hostile forces. It requires love as part of the establishment of justice. In Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis asks us to remember that the gospel is not about occupying territorial space, but rather finding ways to take place in the redemption of time. So it's not about occupying space, it's about taking part in processes that mark the redemption of time. Given that time is one of the things that so many migrants experience as distorted and lost to them, this is very resonant teaching. Francis teaches that we should commit ourselves to real human processes that enact the good in time rather than shoring up power and territory. This is a good challenge to us in thinking about the governance and processes of our organisations, the ways in which we can be truly Catholic. Francis encourages us to think about challenging that cycle of short-termism and transience that even humanitarian and public policy bodies can end up manifesting. He also notes the principle of unity as a reality that prevails over conflict. There is a fundamental social unity, Catholics teach, that can be found and discerned if we refuse to be distracted by conflict. It is much easier to see grounds for conflict and competition than to discern the fundamental unity of reality. Interreligious engagement needs to seek this reality, Francis teaches. And Francis defines dialogue as an openness to truth and love. Openness to truth requires us to talk about differences in order to seek unity. He talks about a dialogue that seeks communion, but not necessarily consensus. One of the key defining ways in which the Catholic tradition thinks about the common good that's different from other forms of political thought is that the common good is not about consensus. It's not about the formation of a single mind. It's about the life of communion and the encounter and dialogue that builds that. Francis returns again and again to his idea of social peace. Peace is not just the absence of violence or warfare, but an abiding commitment to upholding justice, dignity, solidarity, and the common good. Peace is not, therefore, a negotiated settlement or a contract, but rather, quote, a conviction that the unity brought about by the Spirit can harmonise every diversity. And here we return to the vision of the book of Jeremiah. From nothing less than Jeremiah's letter to the exiles, a book or a text written by Jeremiah to other exiles, a message revealed to Jeremiah the migrant as a prophecy from Yahweh. Our task is nothing less, he says, than seeking for the justice and the peace of the city. We seek the justice and peace of the city, not for its own sake, but for the redemption of all.
We have a little time for discussion or questions to our speaker.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Ms. Anna for making me or us understand our faith, and also how I come from Uganda. I am Monsignor Francis Ndamira, Director of Caritas Uganda. And I'm very grateful for making us understand and deepen the theology of our Holy Father. I am on the ground with refugees and migration. On the ground, what we are facing is that we, as a church, we are facing, it seems, treating symptoms as regards the refugees coming to our countries or leaving our countries, serving them as much we can in terms of receiving them as human beings, and also deliver the services we have spiritually and materially. But the causes become very complex, both for the church, and some of them are very political, and a large part of them, maybe in Africa, are very political, although looking for a better livelihood is also there. And these causes, we have nothing to do. I mean, it is just impossible to see people ruling for ages, and where democracy is a big challenge. I don't know what you advise us. I mean, theologically, we can understand and we can do something. We are doing something. But the causes is very far stretched. I don't know what the Vatican can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Rowland, would you like to respond?
One of the things that I think the Church's teaching has to offer more widely is its work on just economic structures and failures of governance. So it has a framework for thinking about those matters, which I think the Church can use at a national level, and I think it can use it to deal with some of the more complex causes which I think exist. However, in my own situation, in my own context at least, I also see that much of what is felt to be unjust and can feel structural happens at a local level as well. So that there is a reality which feels very far away and feels as if it's about policy, but there are also practices of injustice that manifest themselves and are felt in local contexts. And that's where we have a real chance to make a difference at a neighbourhood level, at a city and province level. So my own view is that the wider symptoms and causes can be and must be addressed at all of those levels, and that the Church's teaching does have material to offer us to think about those kind of economic issues of injustice as well. But I think that one of the things that the Church has been trying to do is to try to use its own role as a global messenger, and I think that Pope Francis has been particularly successful in doing this, at making a very, very clear case for a politics of compassion. And he's one of the very few leaders on a global stage who is willing to constantly offer a positive messaging in a very political context about welcome, hospitality, compassion, and mutual obligation, and a willingness to see refugees and migrants as agents, not just as passive people who are to be acted upon, whether it's with kindness or with hostility. So I think that there is something about the way in which he's dealing with the deep causes in the human heart, as well as the structural external causes, that we need to be able to see and work with and use to its best effect in our own contexts.
Thank you. Father Boniface.
My name is Bonnie Mendes. I am from Pakistan, a diocesan priest. My question from Dr. Anna is about the reference to Jeremiah. Excuse my ignorance of scriptures, especially without the text. I couldn't really place this, how it would fit it in with migrants, refugees, people on the move. Thank you.
So the book of Jeremiah itself is one of the most significant books in the Old Testament that deals with migration as a theme. So Jeremiah himself is, as the author of the book, is leading a community as a prophet where the community themselves are displaced, and there are different kinds of displacement and status in the book. So one of the things that's really interesting is that one of the messages that's given to the people in the book of Jeremiah is, look, you're going to be forcibly displaced, just go with it, accept it. This is a kind of holy displacement, and eventually this will be restored to you. So they go willingly into exile in Babylon. And in the text, I won't get too technical, but there's a specific name in Hebrew for those who go willingly into their forced displacement, into their exile. And they're told to till the land, make new relationships, and to settle for what will be a generation, so 70 years. And there's a whole series of rules about how they should live in Babylon when they're living as a community of exile. And that material's interesting just in itself. However, there's another group of migrants who refuse to go willingly into their forced displacement and choose their own path. And so they go and they have a different name. In the text, the less technical name they're given is the good figs and the bad figs. So the good figs go into displacement willingly and they follow what's set out before them. But there's another group, the bad figs, who go into Egypt, and they go without even the protection of God, as the text has it, because they have chosen their own route and they don't trust the exile in Babylon. So there's a really interesting setup of different sort of migrant decision-making patterns in the book of Jeremiah itself, and what happens to these two different groups as a result of the choices they make. So it makes it interestingly complex in a very real way. Equally, Jeremiah himself is often the forgotten character, because he himself is displaced. He's also imprisoned. He's also tortured, and they attempt to murder him. So he himself is a prophet who's acting as God's prophet, who's speaking, who's leading a community as himself somebody who's suffering many of the kind of things that migrants today suffer. Now, I noticed this as a sort of general thing in reading scriptural text, but it came alive for me when I was doing some research with the Jesuit Refugee Service in London recently, and I spent the summer interviewing refugees who are destitute in the UK system. So they're what the UK would call failed asylum seekers. They've run out of their legal possibilities. And I asked them about their faith journeys. And the single text that came back most often was a text from Jeremiah. So the text that came back, repeatedly, it was the same line, it was the same text, is that God has a plan for my welfare. And that text was simply the most repeated text in the interviews that I did. But one of the things that was most interesting about, can I have 60 more seconds? Is that allowed? Sorry, this is a bit lengthy. One of the things that was most interesting about the way in which the refugees I was working with interpreted that text was not just that they'd found it consoling, that the idea that there was a plan and a plan for the good. And of course I was drawn to it because it's language about the good. But they were saying, the thing is, it's not like Jeremiah knows what the ending is going to be. The whole point is that you have to prepare for unexpected ends. So there is a plan for your good, but that plan involves unexpected ends. We have to suspend the question of the end, but live well in what is, knowing that it isn't necessarily the end. And the complex, nuanced way in which they were interpreting that passage was really interesting to me. And when I went back and looked at how biblical scholars have interpreted that passage, they were interpreting it as if there was a fixed end. So there was something spiritually very deep in the way that migrants are living with that passage and that text. So that's one of the reasons why I was drawing on Jeremiah.
Gracias. Soy Guillermo Ortiz Mondragón, obispo de Cuautitlán, México, encargado de la dimensión de movilidad humana por el episcopado. Coincide que estamos elaborando nuestro directorio de pastoral de movilidad humana para México. Esta presentación desde la teología para mí ha sido muy importante. Encuentro muchos elementos y pues algunas coincidencias. Yo diría que este tema viene desde la creación y me permito hacer una reflexión y quiero escuchar su punto de vista. Después del pecado, cuando Adán y Eva se ocultan, habla el texto de que Dios sale y oyen sus pasos. Considero que esto supone que Dios caminaba con Adán y Eva para disfrutar la creación. Así, podríamos decir que el turismo es la movilidad humana por excelencia en la medida que desarrolla esta posibilidad de disfrutar con Dios y en comunión la creación. Pero ellos ya están en el pecado, ya no caminan con Dios. Entonces viene el destierro. Este vacío en la persona humana, vacío de Dios, es el que propicia una visión utilitarista, material de la persona. De por sí, la esclavitud hacia la tierra, que te hará sufrir para que la cultives, etc. No sé si este elemento también entraría en esta percepción teológica que usted nos ha presentado muy rica.
So thank you, and assuming I've understood your question correctly, one of the things that I've done where I have worked with a group of women religious, the Renata Network, who are working on human trafficking issues, is to focus more Christologically, so to focus on the person of Jesus. And the logic that I used in that was to think about the creation material alongside an understanding of Jesus as with. So your use of the phrase with is exactly the logic that I have used for thinking about that work in the context of human trafficking. So I think if I had a slightly different brief and more time this morning, the next journey to go is to develop that Christological line of reasoning, to think about how migrant journeys connect with our understanding of the way in which Jesus works, lives, inhabits and acts through creation. So I think absolutely. So when you write that, send it to me.